Okay, let's get going. First, thank you all for joining today and belated Happy Earth Day. My name is Paige Langer and I'll be walking us through today's webinar on enhancing NDCs in 2020 opportunities in the forest and land use. For our agenda, we're going to be having 4 presentations today. I'll be starting off by providing an overview of the opportunities for enhancing NDCs with forest sector solutions. Next, Kimberley Todd will be presenting on the UNDP's climate promise. After that, Eileen Knowles will be presenting on the NDC Partnership's Climate Action Enhancement Package, and Mr. Carlos Espinosa from Ecuador will be presenting on how Ecuador has integrated nature-based solutions in its NDC. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A, but please, throughout the presentation, feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen to type any questions you may have. I'll now quickly turn it over to Mary, who will give everyone a little overview of Zoom.
Great, thank you so much, and welcome to everybody, and happy belated Earth Day. To best hear us, we suggest you use the computer audio. However, if you experience difficulties, you may select the telephone option and dial in using the appropriate number given in your webinar confirmation email. During the entirety of the webinar, attendees will be in listen mode only. Should you have any questions or comments during the webinar, please utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. We will be monitoring it throughout the presentation and be answering questions during that time as well. Today's presentations will be recorded and sent out via email in approximately 24 hours. Should you experience any difficulties during the webinar or have any questions following the webinar, please utilize the Q&A function, and/or you can email me, Mary Levine, at mary.levine@wri.org. Thank you.
Hello, as I mentioned, my name is Paige Langer and I'm a research analyst at WRI's Global Forest Program based in Washington, DC. Thanks again for joining us today. I'll be kicking off this webinar by providing a brief overview of why and how countries should incorporate forest sector solutions in their nationally determined contributions. While understandably the global pandemic and economic crises are rightly the focus of many governments right now, it is still worth highlighting that many nature-based solutions can deliver on jobs, improved livelihoods, better health, and can not only be incorporated into NDCs, but also any economic recovery packages. So first, let me start by reminding everybody about the forest trifecta. First, we have mitigation. The forest and land sector account for approximately 23% of global net greenhouse gas emissions. But with proper management, the sector can transform from a carbon source to a carbon sink. Many forest sector solutions offer significant carbon removal benefits that can be deployed immediately and at scale. Second, the forest and land sector provide an equally important benefit of climate adaptation. Forests can help countries and communities adapt to climate change by mitigating the impacts of floods, droughts, and heat waves, all of which expected are to worsen under climate change. Finally, forest-based solutions are closely linked to a number of sustainable development goals, such as ending poverty, achieving food security, and ensuring water availability. Oops, looks like I'm sharing my screen incorrectly. Let's see if I can do this differently. Sorry, everyone. Let's try this again. Okay. Despite the numerous and diverse benefits that despite the numerous and diverse benefits that forest sector solutions provide, the first nationally determined contributions have not communicated to the, that were communicated to the, 2015 did not make full use of the potential that forest solutions or lack the needed specificity, which could result in missing substantial opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in cost-effective ways. Major forest sector solutions with significant emission reduction potential, such as reforestation, forest conservation, and afforestation, were the most prevalent solutions in the country's first round of NDCs, but numbered at less than 35. Wetlands, such as mangroves and peatlands, despite their larger carbon storage capacity, attracted even less attention. As you can see from the bar chart here, across the board, policy measures are more prevalent than specific greenhouse gas targets, which makes reporting and quantifying emissions reductions from the sector even more challenging. Upon reviewing previously submitted NDCs, we can find some key opportunities for enhancement. First, forest conservation. The world has lost over 30 million hectares of tree cover in the last few years. Reducing deforestation and degradation, particularly in primary forests, offers significant low-cost mitigation opportunity and provides adaptation and sustainable development co-benefits as well. Similarly, reforestation and restoration can provide up to 10 gigatons of emission reductions per year. Where land use demand for food production is high, agroforestry and silvopastoral systems may provide alternative mitigation opportunities. Finally, the inclusion of peatlands and mangroves is another key area for countries to focus on in their NDCs. Peatlands and mangroves store 2 to 3 times more carbon than upland forest, and mangroves provide significant adaptation co-benefits by quelling storm surges, protecting coastal communities, and providing livelihoods for fishermen. So finally, some specific ways to incorporate forest sector commitments in updated NDCs. There are many different kinds of options for countries when considering which types of forest sector targets to include in their NDC. By including quantitative greenhouse gas targets, such as tons of carbon emission reduction from reduced deforestation or tons of CO2 removed through reforestation, countries can effectively communicate increased ambition. In addition to greenhouse gas targets, countries can add quantitative non-greenhouse gas targets, such as hectares to be designated as protected areas or total hectares of land to be reforested. In addition to quantitative targets, countries can expand the scope of their NDCs by including additional types of land, such as agriculture, grasslands, mangroves, peatlands. Countries can include additional types of solutions, such as agroforestry or silvopastoral systems. Countries can also include cross-sectoral approaches by coordinating with the infrastructure, energy, and transportation sectors. Countries can also strengthen their forest sector commitments by setting a greenhouse gas target for the forest sector in addition to setting an economy-wide greenhouse gas target, which will fully integrate the forest sector. Finally, specific policies and actions, including codifying land tenure for Indigenous peoples, regulating timber production, or including REDD+ in NDCs, can all enable greater ambition. Thank you again to all of you for joining. Before we turn to our next speaker, I want to quickly highlight WRI's Step Up 2020 resource page, where you can find the Forest Sector Guide, as well as guides on power, transport, and agriculture, as well as an overarching guidance and implementation guidance. I also want to remind everybody to keep using your Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer all the questions live or at the end of the webinar. With that, we will turn over to Kimberley Todd, who is a technical specialist with the UNDP Climate and Forest Program based in New York. She provides technical and policy advisory support on REDD+ and forest and land use components of NDCs.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Paige. And thank you for having me join this webinar. Great to be with everyone. So I will pick up from where Paige left off, and I'll be speaking about enhancement opportunities in forest and land use in the context of the climate promise, which is UNDP's sort of main program to support countries on NDC enhancement. Sorry. Okay. So UNDP's climate promise has the objective to support 100 countries to enhance their NDCs with demonstrated increase in ambition. So this is an effort that is building upon not only UNDP's portfolio within the climate and sustainable development space, but most importantly is building on the partnerships that already exist. So this is UNDP's contribution to the NDC partnership, and it's building on sort of already existing partnerships within that context, and particularly for the forest sector, building on the partnership with FAO and UN Environment in the context of the UN RED program. So we've received requests from 110 governments for support on NDC enhancement for this round in 2020, and 70 of these work plans are now in implementation already. And these cut across all regions, and the countries are here on the slide, as you can see. So the climate promise is delivering services in the area of NDC enhancement across a number of key service lines. So we're not only looking at, though focusing on enhancing ambition, but also looking at broader enhancement opportunities, as you can see here, building political will and societal ownership at national and subnational levels, strengthening the transparency of the NDCs, updating data, improving quality of data, in addition to looking at updating existing targets, policies, and measures, and incorporating new sectors and/or greenhouse gases. So these service lines were developed based on a major sort of survey that went out to we received responses from over 130 countries, looking at what were the challenges, what were the bottlenecks with NDC implementation already, and what were the priorities in terms of enhancement for this round. And these service lines track very closely and were informed by the work with WRI and what is reflected in the enhancement guidance in terms of the suggested process of enhancing NDCs, as well as the different types of enhancement reflected in that guidance, which Paige has already directed everyone to. So you see these service areas are cross-cutting across sectors, across both mitigation and adaptation. And what we're seeing in the area of forest and land use is that all of these service areas are relevant for the sector, and we're seeing requests and suggested activities across all of these 5 service lines. So that was just a bit on the climate promise overview. I wanted to turn to one of the sections in the WRI enhancement module for forest and land use is looking at opportunities to strengthen policies and measures. And as Paige has already mentioned, RED+ is one of the key examples highlighted there. So just wanted to touch on this in a bit more detail. So we see RED+ as certainly a key area, a key opportunity area for enhancing the NDCs. So we do have a number of examples where you look at the NDCs, and in those cases where countries have been implementing RED+, and if they have already had their national RED+ strategy and or an investment plan for RED+ at the time of developing the first NDC, it follows, as you would expect, or likely expect, that you often see a corresponding level of detail contained within the NDC on RED+, and it's featured relatively prominently. or the country, has decided to make that a key feature of the NDC, of the contribution. So Ghana is one case of this, where the National Red Plus strategy was developed in the same year as the first NDC submission, and is well reflected in detail. It follows the same structure as the National Red Plus strategy in the NDC. However, what we see in I think more cases, and this gets to the point of the full potential being realized just yet in the first round. And in the case of many Red Plus countries, strategies were still being developed. So the countries might have been engaging in the consultations and in the development process for the strategies, but they weren't finalized until after the INDCs were submitted, which, as we know, in most cases became the first NDCs. So the specificity and the quantification that may have later appeared in the National Red Plus strategy could not be reflected just because of timing. There could be other reasons, but just for that simple reason as well. And Cambodia referred to this actually as an example in their first NDC, recognizing that they were still in the process of developing the Red Plus strategy, and that a more precise list of actions and greenhouse gas impacts could then be updated after finalization of the strategy. So that's already, that can be a quick win in a number of countries already. To look to the Red Plus strategy as one example of strengthening in terms of detail and enhancing the NDC in this round. There are a number of other specific entry points, and I won't go through all of these in detail for lack of time, for sake of time, but the first one I've already mentioned in terms of the National Red Plus strategies. And these are organized according to those service areas I mentioned earlier. Another key area we're seeing is a real priority for many countries in the forest and land use space, is of course looking at the element of transparency, MRV, as well as the elements that can be brought into the NDC to facilitate clarity, transparency, and understanding. So it's not only the transparency of the NDC itself and how can the data and methodological assumptions and so on potentially be clarified in the NDC this year, but also how can the systems be set up to improve over time. And in this case, again, there's space here to look to red as an example in those countries where there's been a lot of progress on national forest monitoring systems, and this work can be built upon. And now looking forward in the enhanced transparency framework context. And then, of course, we have the area of new sectors and our greenhouse gases, which has been mentioned several times. So in some cases, the forest sector may be considered for inclusion, but as indicated earlier, forests, at least in a general sense, have already been recognized in the majority of NDCs. So in many cases, it may be that forests are there, but in a more general or limited way. So there are other options to bring in potentially categories within the sector that haven't been looked to, such as non-CO2 greenhouse gases from fires, so LULUCF may be there as a sector, but there may be a specific additional inclusion that can be made in this round if countries consider that. So to give an idea of some specific examples, I just wanted to say quickly, so in the context of the climate promise, as I said, we have about 110 countries, 70 with work plans already in implementation. And what we see in those 110 countries is that you have over half that included some specific element on land use, forest and land use, the LULUCF sector in their climate promise work plans, so in their planned activities. This just a quick note to say, though, that this is a bit of an underestimate because, again, this is only looking at those countries where there's a specific request referring to LULUCF or forest. But what you have, of course, as we said before, a number of the NDCs have already included LULUCF, and the enhancements that they're looking to in a number of cases are more cross-cutting across sectors. So clearly forests will be part of the scope of that activity. So it might be, for example, looking at the costing of the full NDC scope, but that request didn't specifically refer to forests because it's already in there in the overall scope. So just to say that the work that will be done in the forest and land use sector exceeds the data that's here on this slide. But so clearly over half then are doing some work related to LULUCF. And this is fairly consistent across regions for the most part, at least where we're working with tropical forest countries in the context of REDD. That's definitely the case. So just a couple of quick country examples, one from each of those regions to show more specifically within those broader categories that Paige and I have both spoken to, some of what we're seeing that countries are embarking on in order to improve their data, in order to look at the consistency between their REDD+ work and their NDC, and so on. So you see activities here in the case of Zimbabwe, for example. A lot of the work is technically focused, again, to improve the data over time and to be able to reflect that in the NDC. Cambodia, as I mentioned before, the focus is very much on bringing in what's in the REDD+ national strategy and the investment plan into the NDC, or looking at crosswalking those and bringing in what can be incorporated. And finally, in Paraguay, similar, looking at the strategy, the national forest strategy, and using that as a basis for the NDC enhancement in this sector. So a lot of interesting work and a lot of opportunity is starting to be realized by a number of countries. Just wanted to, I think that's all I have, and I will turn it back over to Paige. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim. Next, we have Eileen Knowles, who is the Knowledge Management and Outreach Specialist at the NDC Partnership. Before joining the partnership, Eileen worked in corporate sustainability reporting and ESG as manager of special projects at CDP. Take it away, Eileen.
Perfect. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, perfect. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you, Paige, for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to share the work of the NDC Partnership with you today. For those of you who may not have heard of us before, we are a coalition of countries and institutions collaborating to drive transformational climate action while enhancing sustainable development. Our coalition is made up of 106 countries, 39 international institutions, and 27 associate members. We are hosted by WRI and the UNFCCC and work closely with the UNDP and the government of Ecuador. So today we're here amongst friends. The NDC Partnership was set up to support countries to implement their NDCs. Sorry, I'm hearing some echo. Hello?
I think it might have stopped. I think you're good to go.
Okay, sorry about that. I'll start back in the previous slide. Sorry, perfect. There we go. So let me just regroup myself. Yes. So the NDC Partnership was set up to support countries to implement their NDCs fast and effectively. The partnership launched the Climate Action Enhancement Package, or CAP, as a means to support countries that are preparing enhanced NDCs for 2020 and that are looking for ways to raise ambition. All developing country members of the NDC Partnership were invited to submit requests for support through CAP for specific mitigation and adaptation activities and commitments. We are seeing impressive progress, with the partnership supporting more than 65 countries to deliver real climate and development action. Through CAP, we will be delivering $35 million to support over 700 individually country-led activities. Okay. The patterns of requests made through CAP provide insights into how countries are approaching their NDC updates in 2020. 89% of countries are requesting forest and land use related support through CAP, second only to energy related requests. the proportion of regional requests we're seeing in forestry and land use mirror overall requests for all sectors, with most requests coming from Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, signaling the importance of forest and land use across all regions. At an activity level, 8% of all requests refer to forestry and land use. Of these, 75% of activities made requests under CAP's Objective 1, which is to enhance NDCs, including by raising ambition and updating NDCs. This demonstrates the clear linkages and potential between effective forest and land use management and enhancement. The remaining 25% of activities were aimed at fast-tracking the implementation of NDCs under CAP's Objective 2. Panama and the Central African Republic had the biggest concentration of forest and land use requests, with a full list of countries captured here. In terms of support, partners are supporting 100% of forest and land use activities for NDC enhancement, backed by a wide range of donors, demonstrating clear alignment between donor priorities and country needs, which is not something that is evident across all CAP sectors. Forest and land use activities emerge most frequently in activities focused on defining or updating GHG and other NDC targets. Forest and land use activities overlap most frequently with activities related to studies, gap analysis, and feasibility assessments, demonstrating countries' interest in fully understanding and maximizing forest and land use opportunities. As would be expected, these requests most often overlap with the agriculture and energy sectors. Nicaragua, for example, is looking to formulate a national forest protection plan aimed at reaching zero deforestation. Nigeria will integrate and update the NDC and the Afolu sector, which covers approximately 30% of the country's emissions. Pakistan will monitor the impact of forestry projects to quantify the carbon sequestration, enhance watershed values, and role in biodiversity conservation and habitat improvement. Albania will review their current NDC by adding a follow sector under the mitigation target. And the Central African Republic will quantify the capacity of ecosystem services to sequester carbon. These are just a handful of examples of what countries are doing. A full list of activities requested to CAP and sectoral and regional analysis are available through our knowledge management system, the NOOC. Thank you for the opportunity to share the trends we're seeing through CAP. And I'm sorry for those technical difficulties. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. No problem at all. For our final presentation of the morning, afternoon, or evening, we have Mr. Carlos Espinosa, who is the Undersecretary for Climate Change in the Ministry of Environment of Ecuador. Carlos, take it away. Carlos, you might be muted if you've started.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry. Sorry for the technical difficulty there. Well, first of all, I would like to say good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I would also like to thank the World Resources Institute, the UNDP, and the NDC partnership for generating these spaces of interaction. I would like to greet worldwide government delegates, NGOs, public and private companies, and of course, members of academia. And I would like to take this opportunity, first of all, to share what Ecuador has been doing in recent years and since basically 2008, when our constitution changed and we set up a series of frameworks and public policies to enact climate action, basically, and climate change policies. I would like to take also this opportunity to invite you on behalf of the Ministry of the Environment of Ecuador on April 30th to support, with the support of Fundación Futuro Latinoamericano. First of all, what I want to share with you today is integration of nature-based solutions in the NDC of Ecuador. So Ecuador, first of all, is a mega diverse country. As I was saying before, Ecuador in 2008 changed its constitution, basically reformed the new constitution. It was very innovative in the sense of recognizing legal standing for nature. This recognition of nature as a subject of rights basically grants it legal standing before the judicial system. Ecuador, as you know, is a mega diverse country. Nature preservation, the conservation of natural ecosystem biodiversity, was the prevention of environmental damage and restorative degraded natural spaces are both a priority for the Ministry of the Environment, but also the series of legislation, frameworks, and international treaties that Ecuador has ratified in the past years. Ecuador currently has 56 protected areas on a national basis. It has 60% of its territory covered by natural ecosystems, and over 50% is covered by native forest within continental Ecuador. Remember that Ecuador is also, the Galapagos Islands are also part of Ecuador. That's why the distinction with continental Ecuador. Now, as I was mentioning, what is innovative in this sense is Ecuador's regulatory frameworks in terms of what it guarantees towards nature. Aside from granting legal standing, the legal frameworks and public policies that have been enacted therefore from that point on, basically generate a series of legal guarantees and protection of forests, biodiversity, and environmental services. This was, of course, starts with the 2008 Constitution, but was recently, let's say, pushed forward by Ecuador's environmental code, which basically was the first legislation in Ecuador that compiled all environmental legislation, and from that on, it created a bylaw, the bylaw to the environmental code, which enacts these series of policies. Of course, within this, there is a specific section of the code that basically focuses on climate change policy. Now, this has happened between 2017, 2019. However, Ecuador already had a national climate change strategy earlier on, 2012, if I'm not mistaken. And this has been something that, because of our constitutional framework, has been enacted within our national development plan. Aside from recognizing the rights of nature or nature's legal standing, it's also our constitution incorporated a series of parts mentioning climate change and, let's say, the actions the state was called to enact on that behalf. Now, legal frameworks, aside from other regulations, also have to do with, as I mentioned, our Ecuador's commitment to international treaties. In this sense, obviously, REDD+, the REDD+ action plan, and other enabling international legislation to enact climate change policy in Ecuador. Now, the action plan REDD+ Ecuador has the basic obvious objective of reducing greenhouse gas emissions caused by deforestation. In this sense, Ecuador has both with international cooperation as well as from national solutions and national policy, has created a series of policies and institutional management to enact this objective. Of course, this is a gradual process that Ecuador has been enacting in the past years. And what the objective here was to create both, we had the legal framework, but obviously creating the institutional and interinstitutional frameworks that allow this to operate both from the executive government to local governments was obviously a step of incremental points. Now, the objective here is to create a transition to sustainable production systems, a sustainable forest management, and obviously conservation and restoration. In this sense, one of the main, Ecuador is a primary resource export country. Let's say banana, let's say shrimp, let's say roses, is obviously trying also to create, and this is a major effort from the part of the Ministry of the Environment, enacting legislation that actually allows sustainable production to take place. And this has been helped in implementation with programs like Amazonia, results-based payments, which is Programa REM Ecuador, and the GCF results-based payments project. All of this has been focused on both conservation and also trying to enhance the way that Ecuador produces and also to avoid deforestation and land degradation. Now, in terms of the REDD+ action plan, nature-based solutions are one of the main parts of the solution to fight climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions from forests. Obviously, this interacts a series of very important parts of public policy, which are, for example, food security and what our Constitution actually enacts is food sovereignty, which is basically trying to create a production system that allows for sustainable agricultural practices that also do use endogenous products from Ecuador. Obviously, protection of biodiversity, sustainable agriculture, and forest and ecosystems protection. And I would like to make a specific point on sustainable agriculture, because I think that in the current times and what we're seeing due to the current health crisis we're looking at, part of the ministries and the Ecuadorian government's vision is to see how exactly we can make this shift towards a sustainable agricultural production frameworks and chains. Obviously, one of the main parts we're looking at right now is the type of production we have and the economic systems we have behind them. So I think projects like nature-based solutions within the RED Plus project are obviously a good starting point on trying to create innovative ideas that both protect biodiversity, but also create sustainable agriculture to actually allow for livelihoods to be better off and protect, in that sense, forest and ecosystems. Now, sorry for a minute, I think I lost. Give me a second. I'm sorry, I'm having a technical problem.
Hi, Carlos, this is Mary. If you'd like me to run your slides for you, I'm more than happy to do so.
I just had a technical problem, I think, right now. Is it sharing?
Yes, you're sharing.
Yes, okay, perfect. Terribly sorry for that. Now, in terms of Ecuador's NDC, it's important to highlight, I believe, the consensus-based process of construction that Ecuador's NDC had. What the policy the Ecuadorian government has tried to create towards climate change and Ecuador's NDC and Ecuador's international commitments basically has been from bottom-up approach. It's been focused on communities. It's had wide participatory processes. And Ecuador right now, from NDC, from Ecuador's presentation of its NDCs towards its internal legislation of a presidential decree that actually enacted it as law in Ecuador, has been a process of these past years. In this sense, Ecuador at this point is taking a step up in terms of creating our national mitigation plan and our national adaptation plan. Within this, of course, the sectors we have, I'm sorry for the slide, it's only in Spanish. However, just to highlight within mitigation, of course, energy, industrial processes, agriculture, and amongst others. And one of the main points I'd like to highlight here is within mitigation, as I was mentioning before, and I think this opportunity of seeking innovative solutions towards climate change, but also to the ways of we're going to deal with some of the current problems we're facing due to COVID-19 and some other questions, which I think are important in terms of what Ecuador has been trying or attempting to do in the past years through Pro Amazonia and RED Plus and results-based payments, has been to create, to try to enact certain projects that actually allow for a responsible climate action towards agriculture. In one case, one of the programs we've been having is towards livestock, and trying to map out how many greenhouse gas emission reductions we could actually map. And I think on a more long-term view in terms of Ecuador's long-term climate ambition is Ecuador's current elaboration of its national adaptation plan. The national adaptation plan is a very important piece of policy framework that Ecuador is currently developing as it seeks to enact policies that can actually secure Ecuador's, for instance, food security, food sovereignty, and also access to water. And these are the main focus points, not because any other sector should be left behind, but these are main sector points in terms of securing Ecuador's citizens the possibility of actually enacting long-term solutions towards both climate change and many other problems. Now, opportunities, obviously there are opportunities within REDD+ and nature-based solutions. What Ecuador seeks and what the Ministry of the Environment of Ecuador seeks is to improve its scope. Of course, one of it is that REDD+ allows a greater scope in the NDC for deforestation. Second of all, sustainable national forest monitoring system. Three, it mainstreams the need for resources to monitor other REDD+ activities. And four, it allows for a gradual increase in the capabilities of comprehensive management of nature. Now, obviously, these are all fields in which we can improve scope. However, one of the challenges, one of the tribulations we might have in doing all of this is obviously creating, once again, you could have the legislation, you could have the treaties, but obviously creating the institutional legal policy frameworks that actually allows this to happen, with also the technical capabilities of doing it. So amongst the challenges Ecuador faces at this moment within this program is to monitor deforestation, degradation, reforestation, and sustainable forest management. There are also external requirements without considering national circumstances. And I think this is a very important, an important part when we create initiatives that are obviously far-reaching on an international scope, but there are obviously external requirements in terms of projects and targets. However, national circumstances vary. What is true for Ecuador might not be true for any other country, or what is true in a specific moment within an international treaty or international framework, circumstances change. And I think this is something that also has to be the creation of an adaptive and incremental change in policy is also necessary to actually take into consideration unexpected situations, such as the one the world is living at this point. So situations change, and I think this is something that sometimes is not taken into consideration within national circumstances. And finally, one of the main challenges we see for future dates is updating the reference level of forest emissions. Once again, the technical, let's say, challenges we face are obviously, they can be taken care of, but the time it takes to do this is also an incremental learning curve that needs to be taken shortly and through a clear policy action. Now, Ecuador as an example is not to antagonize other countries, but Ecuador is an example in terms of what Ecuador has been doing legal framework. And I think it's very important because the enactment of policies from an international scope to a domestic policy is also important in terms of what a country decides or is able to do with its legal framework and its national policies. I think Ecuador as an example is simply refers to as Ecuador using or completing or actually doing a comprehensive revision of what Ecuador enacted in its constitution. In this sense, programs such as REDD+ and nature-based solutions are ways of enacting within public policy through Ecuador's NDC and a way of ratifying Ecuador's commitment and what Ecuador's citizens enacted in 2008 within its constitution to protect, towards the protection and responsible management of forests and ensure their long-term preservation. Of course, in this sense, Ecuador has also taken initiatives that try or has participated in initiatives that make this happen. For example, the signing of Pacto de Leticia in September 2019 amongst the Amazonian countries is also an example of a regional push to actually enact this. And I think that as the Ecuador's Minister of the Environment has recently spoken with ministers, other environmental ministers of the region, is what this actually means in the future towards a post-COVID world. What exactly are the policies both Ecuador and its neighbors and other Amazonian countries are actually looking or seeking to enact? In this sense, obviously, the Amazon is the Amazon rainforest is the lung of the world. It's necessary to see how Ecuador has been doing an effective monitoring of timely data generation, and also to seek how both Ecuador and on a region-wide basis to preserve both forest and obviously the Amazon is to create sustainable development without compromising forest. In this sense, I think that, and I think the point that I would like to highlight in my presentation is basically both through the aid of international cooperation, through Ecuador's commitment towards completing and successfully applying its constitutional framework. From this point on, I believe it's a good moment beyond the current world circumstances to actually start posing some of these very, very profound questions in terms of how will sustainable development look for Ecuador, for the region, without compromising its forest and also creating higher climate ambition. That's my presentation. I would like to thank you. I would also like to thank the organizers on behalf of Ecuador and the Minister of the Environment, and obviously I'm open to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of our presentations, and now we will go to the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question for any of the panelists, feel free to type it into the Q&A box. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can now. Otherwise, we can answer them after the webinar. I will start with a question for Kimberley Todd. Question is there an effort by UNDP Climate Promise and others to support countries to submit their NDCs in a consistent manner?
Thanks so much, Paige, and thank you for the question. So when we talk about consistency, I would say the focus of the support is really working with countries to look at their various efforts and reports and data sources and look for internal consistency amongst those, as opposed to looking at enabling complete consistency internationally. Speaking, for example, if we look specifically to the GHG context, of course we know countries need to be looking to the IPCC guidance as the main guidance to be consistent with. But even within IPCC, there's flexibility built in to allow countries to work from their starting point and with their data and so on. So I just think it's important to reflect that these NDCs, again, are nationally driven, and we need to countries have their starting points that they're working with, their greenhouse gas data when it comes to sustainable development benefits, particular indicator sets, and so on. So we're not sort of focusing on complete consistency across countries, again, because of that nationally driven nature and because of the flexibility that's inherent in the guidance that countries need to be working with in the first place. Hope that helps answer the question. Thanks.
Thank you. We had another question that was partially answered, but questions about how COVID-19 is changing or not changing any requests and submissions for NDCs from countries. Eileen, do you want to take a first stab at that? And then Kim, I can ask you to add anything on.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. I think that's obviously a very relevant question and something that we're thinking quite a bit about with both our country partners, but also with implementing partners. I think the answer would be that things are different in a case-by-case basis. I think what we are doing as a partnership is we're trying to mitigate those risks with implementing partners, and we're trying to have a sort of frank conversation with governments around how does COVID change priorities and immediate sort of urgencies in their respective contexts. So I think to say is that there is really no definite answer as to whether there will be a delay because of this. We have seen some countries, and Chile as an example, that has already submitted enhanced NDCs, and we have conversations with countries that we know will be submitting on time, but we definitely expect that there will be some delays.
Thanks. Kim, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. Not much. I think Eileen covered it really well, and I answered a bit in the chat just to say that countries are currently working through their work plans, at least for the climate promise, and coming up with contingency planning in the context of COVID, which of course is very challenging right now because it's all still developing and it's still uncertain. And, you know, the waves, of course, will hit differently in different places. But there's at least a consideration of, you know, a lot of the types of consultations and whatnot that were planned, you know, countries are working through what can realistically be done virtually versus delayed, and so on. So yeah, we're definitely seeing still a big push to get these moving and get them in, but I think you know, with anticipated delays, of course. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a couple questions about agroforestry, and I will highlight that there is a complete agricultural webinar and guide that is also on WRI's website. Both the forest sector and the agriculture sector touch on this, obviously, as it intersects both of them. The first question is for Carlos. Is agroforestry in Ecuador's NDC?
Indeed, agroforestry is part of Ecuador's NDC and part of the solutions that obviously we're trying to build. And I think also both in NDC and also in the programs that Ecuador has now, it's important to have that agroforestry is in Ecuador handled by two ministries, both agriculture and both the Ministry of Agriculture, both the Ministry of the Environment. In this sense, policies are both institutions. Let's say do a cross check on each other in terms of creating agroforestry policy, and in this sense also this is translated into Ecuador's NDC.
Great, thank you. And Kim or Eileen, do you have any specific examples of projects or incorporations that you've worked on some of your countries? Feel free to pass that on and we can respond later if you don't.
At the moment, just to say those work plans where I was involved in reviewing the technical details, I have not come across specific agroforestry references, but that's to say a lot of the work is a bit more generally focused around forests or LULUCF or NBS, so it doesn't mean that the country's not anticipating that agroforestry would be part of that. But what I can do is go back and see if we have in some of the other work plans in some of the other countries I haven't been looking at more closely, if we do have specific agroforestry activities in there. And maybe we can share that as part of the package of additional information going out to participants afterwards, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think this is Eileen. Just to say that we can do the same. You know, I haven't come across plans personally, but we have a whole database of all activities that have been submitted by countries. So we can definitely follow up with what our findings.
Great, thank you both. And just a friendly reminder to everyone to please use the Q&A box for any questions you have. This is the way we can monitor them and answer them in an organized fashion instead of using the chat box. Carlos, I have another question for you, if that's okay. Talking about is Ecuador planning to make, you know, NDCs part of Ecuador's recovery package or long-term, or how you guys are coordinating you know, the NDCs and any recovery packages going forward?
Well, of course, Ecuador is the NDC, and I might not have understood the question. Does this refer to recovery packages post-COVID-19, I imagine, or post-recovery packages in what sense? I'm sorry, I might.
Yes, that is my assumption.
I assume that's the correct, okay. Just to put this into perspective, obviously, Ecuador is looking into its NDC. However, our NDC revision is not until a couple of years later on. However, I think that the current circumstances, the current context we're facing demands that both Ecuador and I imagine other countries take new and novel steps towards policy solutions. And obviously this will translate not only into Ecuador's NDC, but into many other parts of public policy in terms of climate action, in terms of Ecuador's NDC and international commitments towards climate change. I think that it's very important what I was highlighting before. The Minister of the Environment of Ecuador has recently proposed a meeting on a regional basis from the signatory countries of the Pacto de Leticia, which basically was the result of the Amazonian fires that happened last year. And I think that I believe that one of the main points here is to actually create these spaces of dialogue amongst countries to actually see what this means on a regional basis and also on a local basis, on domestic policy creation, because obviously policies will have to shift and will have to change. Obviously, this has to do with both climate change, but also the economic impact we are all going to face in this coming 2020. However, as I mentioned, both looking into a recovery package or looking into forward-looking approaches towards policy solutions, I think it's important to highlight that although the current context and current circumstances have been a challenge, I also think, and I believe, and it's also the Minister of the Environment of Ecuador's belief, that it also creates the possibility of opening questions in new policy spaces that have not yet been discussed or have not been discussed fully. So in this sense, of course, it'll take into consideration, but obviously this has been a very recent event. So how we will look at this and what exactly this will look into is obviously novel. However, I can highlight that within what I was mentioning in Ecuador's national adaptation plan, the sectors that we were focusing or prioritizing are now more relevant than ever in terms of securing agriculture, food security, food sovereignty, and also access to water. So I think that at least the basic structure, the building blocks are there. The thing is how we all come to a new agreement as both Ecuador and amongst world leaders and amongst different constituencies to actually generate these new frameworks. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We'll do a couple more questions, going a few minutes past 10:30 Eastern time to answer as many as possible. Again, if you have any questions, type them in the box and we will respond to them either now or afterwards. So the next question I will actually take, and if anybody wants to chime in, they can feel free to. We've had some questions about Initiative 2020 commitments, bond challenge commitments. For those who don't know, these are restoration commitments. Initiative 2020 based in Latin America. Bond challenge is global. There's also an AFR 100 for African countries. And yes, the answer is the question is, how are you assessing the contributions to these commitments for NDCs? Is in the WRI guidance, we encourage countries to work with policies and institutions that they have already submitted commitments on. So if countries have submitted restoration commitments under Initiative 2020, by 2020, for instance, they should absolutely be including that. I don't know of any assessment to see how much overlap there is, but this is definitely something, not just for restoration, but any types of forest sector commitments that a country has made should definitely be integrated into their NDC. The next question that a lot of people have asked is regarding the timeline for NDC submissions. I can't quite tell who was willing to answer that one, but Kim, can I start with you?
Sure. I mean, I suppose with the delay of the COP, we might expect more flexibility. But as far as I'm aware, there has been no sort of official word on that. I mean, the deadline for NDCs when the COP was planned for November was for these to come in 9 months before, but even that was considered, fairly flexible. The idea that deadline was there in order to allow sort of global assessments of the numbers and how it all adds up. But I think already, it was understood that countries would be likely coming in more likely, a few months before the COP. So again, like we said before, we're all in a state of sort of uncertainty. So countries are, anticipating these delays, trying to plan for them, planning contingencies, what might need more time, and so on. But what we're seeing so far is that a number of the countries are still, intending to make that push and stick to their original deadlines as best they can. But I personally haven't heard anything sort of official coming out on that, given the delay of the COP. Thanks.
I can add something there. So I think I think, well, echoing what was just said, but also to mention that there hasn't been an official extension, and there's still a call for activities to be submitted by the end of 2020.
Great, thank you both. We'll do one or two more questions. The next one is for Carlos regarding the private sector. Private sector is an important source of innovation and solutions for climate change. Could you talk a little bit about how you've been working with the private sector? Any examples of specific challenges, specific successes, lessons learned for other countries?
Yes, of course. I agree. Obviously, the private sector is a very important partner in creating any type of long-term solutions. However, as I was mentioning before, we've been creating both cooperation efforts, for instance, with Ecuador's NDC support program, which helps or will build these links. And we as a national policy, the Ministry of the Environment has actually created, let's say, a joint alliance with Ecuador's Ministry of Finance to actually create financial habilitating frameworks to actually create credit and to actually create projects in which the private sector can participate. Amongst it's obviously creating the financial infrastructure that allows private sector engagement is quite important. In other terms, it's also seeking these alliances in terms of how we can support different projects. So for instance, Ecuador's focus within, let's say, private sector is a big word, determining on what part of market segmentation you're looking at. But obviously Ecuador has both created policies that go for instance, towards small farms, to agricultural bases, to large financial innovative policies that could actually create credit and financial lines. And obviously what Ecuador seeks in this point is to create an alliance with the private sector to do this. However, I have to say that what Ecuador has been doing is creating the frameworks, the policy and regulatory mechanisms to actually let this happen. What Ecuador has also been trying to do is succeeding in doing is creating these alliances with the private sector to actually enact specific solutions to create an incremental approach towards what can actually be done on a national basis. This is obviously a complex interaction amongst different actors, but I think that Ecuador, both through its NDC, both through its adaptation, its mitigation plan, and cooperation projects it has with UNDP, with GIZ and others, is creating, AFD, for example, is also creating these habilitating frameworks to actually let the private sector interact by creating a good policy framework from which it can interact. So whilst the framework is being developed, there are many things already rolling that will allow this to happen. It's just a matter of putting everything together, I think, at this point. And obviously, I think the private sector in this sense is also going to be a very important factor in terms of developing this post-COVID scenario that we're looking both in climate action and in other areas. I hope this answers the question. Thank you.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. And with that, I think we will close out at 5 after 10:30. I'd like to thank all the panelists and all the participants for joining us today. This is the last scheduled webinar for the sectoral opportunities to enhance NDCs through WRI. As I mentioned, webinars on the power sector, transport, short-lived climate pollutions, and agriculture can all be found at the link on your screen. And a recording of this webinar will be posted within a couple days. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening or week. Bye-bye.